The conference room is freezing, but my palms are sweating as I stand next to the glowing screen displaying the project I have poured my entire life into for the past few years. I can hear the hum of the air conditioner and the soft scratching of expensive pens against paper as the wealthy executives lean forward, their eyes wide with genuine greed and excitement. My boss, Daniel Reeves, stands up slowly, adjusting his silk tie with a smug expression that makes my stomach do a slow, painful flip. He walks over to the prototype, placing his hand on the sleek metal casing, as if he were the one who stayed up until 4 a.m. for months trying to make the code stable. "My team built this," Daniel says, his voice booming with a false sense of pride that fills the entire room. He doesn't even look at me while he says it. He just keeps smiling at the board of directors like he is a king delivering a gift to his people. "We developed this entirely in-house using our best company resources over the last year. And we are proud to finally show what we can do." The words feel like a physical slap across my face, leaving me breathless and dizzy in the middle of the quiet room. I wait for someone to speak up, for one of my coworkers to look at me with sympathy, but they all just stare at Daniel with admiration. Then, Daniel turns his head slightly toward me, his eyes cold and dismissive for just a split second before he addresses the room again. "And of course, according to the strict contract our employees sign, anything developed under company resources is 100% company property," he adds with a sharp nod. The room hums with deep approval, and I can almost see the dollar signs flashing in their eyes as they realize this innovation is worth at least $15 million. My throat feels tight, like I am swallowing broken glass, because I know the truth that Daniel is conveniently forgetting. I didn't build this on his time, and I certainly didn't use his outdated company computers to create the core algorithm that makes the whole system work. I remember the tiny, cramped apartment I lived in 2 years before I ever even heard of this company, where I worked on a flickering laptop while eating cold noodles just to bring this dream to life. I have the original timestamps, the early sketches, and the raw data that proves this technology was mine long before I signed a single piece of paper for Daniel Reeves. He thinks he can just erase my history and claim my future because he has a bigger office and a louder voice, but he has no idea what he just started. As the executives start clapping and reaching out to shake Daniel's hand, I force my face to stay completely neutral, hiding the fire that is starting to burn in my chest. I won't scream, and I won't make a scene in front of these millionaires who think I am just another replaceable worker. Instead, I pick up my tablet, take a deep breath, and start recording every single word they say, knowing that Daniel just walked into a trap of his own making. I open my mouth to protest, but absolutely nothing comes out, and for a terrifying second, I feel like I am suffocating in the middle of this crowded, expensive room. My hands are still gripping the presentation remote so tightly that my knuckles have turned a ghostly white, but they don't feel like my hands anymore. They feel like heavy, useless weights hanging from my shivering arms. My fingers are stiff and completely numb, and I have this strange, disconnected sensation like I am floating near the ceiling, watching some poor stranger stand there while their entire life and hard work gets rewritten in real time by a thief in a designer suit. Daniel doesn't even look at me again after that first cold glance, acting as if I am just a piece of office furniture or a silent shadow that happens to be standing near his stolen prize. He just keeps talking in that smooth, practice voice, throwing out massive numbers, ambitious growth projections, and detailed plans for market capture that all rely on the technology one created. He is using my words, my logic, and my unique vision to sell a future that he didn't actually earn, and the board members are nodding along like he is some kind of brilliant mechanical genius. My voice is completely gone, stuck somewhere deep in my chest behind a wall of pure shock, and somehow that silence feels 1,000 times worse than if I had stood up and screamed at the top of my lungs. I look at the screen where my complex diagrams are displayed, and I remember the rainy Tuesday 2 years before I ever walked into this building when I finally figured out the math for the primary power cell. I wasn't an employee of Daniel Reeves back then. I was just a hungry college graduate with a big idea and a very old computer in a tiny bedroom. Every line of that code has my digital fingerprint on it from a time when this company didn't even exist in my world, yet Daniel is standing there claiming it was born in his laboratory last month. The executives are already talking about the $15 million valuation as if it's a fact, and I can see Daniel's chest swell with pride as he absorbs all the credit for my long nights of labor. I want to reach out and pull the plug on the machine to delete the files, to tell them all that they are cheering for a lie, but my body refuses to move an inch. I realize then that if I speak now without a plan, Daniel will just use his power to crush me and call me a liar in front of everyone who matters. The silence in my throat is heavy, but as I watch Daniel bask in the stolen glory, a small cold part of my brain starts to wake up and calculate a different way to win. I realize that he thinks my silence is a sign of my total defeat, but he doesn't know that I am actually using these quiet moments to remember every single lie he is telling. He thinks he has won the game before it even started, but the truth is that he has just handed me the perfect weapon by claiming my past as his own property. The sound of the executives clapping is so loud and sharp that it feels like it is echoing inside my very skull, making my ears ring with a dull, persistent ache. One of the senior directors, a man with silver hair and a very expensive-looking watch, leans forward over the mahogany table and stares at my prototype with a look of pure hunger in his eyes. Daniel, this is truly a game-changer for the industry, and based on these initial performance metrics, this innovation could easily be worth $15 million in the first year alone, he says, his voice thick with a kind of excitement that only comes from the prospect of making a massive fortune. Hearing that specific number, $15 million, makes my chest tighten so painfully that it genuinely hurts to draw a full breath of air into my lungs. I look at the device on the table, the one I spent years perfecting in the shadows, and I realize that my boss is about to become a very wealthy man by selling a soul that doesn't belong to him. Daniel nods his head with a fake sense of modesty, looking down at his hands as if he is actually surprised by the wave of praise that he absolutely expected and calculated for when he stole my presentation. Thank you all so much for the kind words, Daniel says, his voice smooth as honey and twice as sickly sweet. We have worked very hard on this project for a long time, and I am just glad to see the vision finally coming to life in such a successful way for the company. That tiny two-letter word, we, feels like a jagged piece of metal being twisted in my gut, because I know there was no we during the cold nights when the sensors kept failing or the weeks I spent debugging the logic gates. I feel something deep inside my spirit go very, very still, like the calm at the center of a massive storm that hasn't quite broken yet. The anger is still there, burning hot and bright, but it is being replaced by a cold, sharp clarity that tells me exactly what I need to do to survive this betrayal. Daniel thinks he is the hero of this story, but he is actually just a thief who has forgotten that every lock has a key, and I am the only one who knows where that key is hidden. As the executives continue to chatter about profit margins and global distribution, I slowly let go of the presentation remote and let my hands fall to my sides, feeling the weight of my phone in my pocket. I realized that Daniel's biggest mistake wasn't just stealing my work. It was assuming that I would be too intimidated by his position to fight back for what is rightfully mine. The room is full of laughter and high fives now, but in the middle of all that noise, my silence has become my strongest armor. The meeting finally ends with a flurry of activity that feels like a blur of expensive suits, and the sharp clicking of briefcases being snapped shut. People file out of the room in a steady stream, lining up just to shake Daniel's hand and congratulate him on a job well done, but not a single person looks at me or acknowledges that I was the one actually standing behind the machine. Daniel finally turns toward me after the last executive has left, offering me a quick, dismissive smile that doesn't even reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Great job presenting today, Abigail," he says, his tone patronizing and light as if he were talking to a child who had just finished a school project. "You really made the data look clean and professional for the board, and I appreciate you keeping the technical side of things so simple for them to understand." He says it like I was just a messenger or a hired hand brought in to polish his brilliant ideas, completely ignoring the fact that the entire invention came from my brain and my hands. I force myself to smile back at him, a tight and controlled expression that masks the absolute fury boiling just beneath the surface of my skin. In that specific moment, as he turns his back on me to check his reflection in the glass wall, I understand something absolutely critical to my survival in this company. Daniel thinks I don't matter at all because he views me as just another replaceable employee, who is too afraid or too poor to challenge his authority. He believes that because he pays my salary, he also owns my past, my private thoughts, and every single spark of creativity I had years before I ever stepped foot in this office. This arrogance is his biggest weakness, and as I watch him celebrate a victory he hasn't earned, I realize that his belief in my insignificance is exactly what will allow me to move in the shadows. I don't correct him and I don't ask for the credit I deserve. Instead, I just nod my head and start gathering my notes with a calm, steady hand. He thinks he has seen the whole picture, but he has no idea that the most important parts of this technology are still locked away in a private drive he can't access. My smile is a mask, a perfect shield that hides the fact that I am already 2 steps ahead of his next move. As I walk out of the conference room, I feel a strange sense of peace because I know that the $15 million innovation he just claimed as company property is actually a ticking time bomb with my name on the trigger. He wants to play a high-stakes game of ownership, and I am more than happy to let him lead the way right into the trap I built 2 years ago. He stands there looking so incredibly proud of himself, adjusted his expensive watch and acting like he just invented fire, but he has absolutely no idea that he is actually standing on a foundation of pure glass that is about to shatter into a million sharp pieces. Daniel honestly thinks I built this entire system for him during my lunch breaks and late nights in the company office, but he doesn't know the real truth that I have been keeping hidden like a buried treasure for a very long time. He doesn't know that I actually finished the core design and the primary code for this $15 million innovation exactly 2 years before I ever even heard the name of this company or signed a single line of his restrictive employment contract. Back then, I was working in a tiny drafty garage with barely enough money to pay for high-speed internet, driven by a vision that kept me awake when the rest of the world was fast asleep. I have every single original timestamp, every early digital footprint, and a mountain of encrypted files that prove this technology was a living, breathing thing long before Daniel Reeves ever tried to put his greedy corporate brand on it. Every time he uses the phrase company property to describe my life's work, I have to bite my tongue to keep from laughing out loud at his massive, world-class stupidity and arrogance. He is so focused on the money and the prestige that he didn't even bother to do a deep dive into the history of the files I brought with me when I was hired as a senior developer. He just assumed that because I am his employee now, everything I touch or show him must have been born under his roof and funded by his bank account. It is a classic mistake made by people who think power is the same thing as ownership, and it is a mistake that is going to cost him every single penny of that $15 million he is already dreaming of spending. As I watch him walk away toward his private office, I realize that the title of this story isn't just a sentence on a page. It is the ultimate legal shield that I am going to use to take back what is mine. He thinks he bought my brain when he hired me, but he actually just invited his own destruction into the building. And the best part is that he was the one who opened the door and welcomed me in. I feel a surge of steady confidence as I head back to my desk, knowing that the most powerful weapon I have isn't a lawyer or a loud voice, but the simple, undeniable truth of the calendar. My name is Abigail Turner, and although I stood in that expensive glass-walled room like a silent ghost, I was actually the most powerful person in the building at that very moment. I didn't say a single word while Daniel Reeves was busy shaking hands and acting like a visionary leader, but my silence wasn't because I was weak, or because I was intimidated by his fancy title. Instead, I stayed quiet because I realized something far more important than just being right or getting a quick pat on the back from a board of directors who don't even know my last name. I realized in that split second that I needed to be incredibly smart and calculated if I wanted to protect the invention that is worth $15 million to this greedy company. If I had started an argument right then, Daniel would have used his army of corporate lawyers to crush me before I could even find my car keys in my bag. He would have called me emotional or confused, and he would have made sure I was fired and blacklisted from the entire engineering industry before the sun went down. By staying silent and letting him believe he had successfully stolen my hard work, I gained the most valuable thing in any professional battle, which is the total element of surprise. I watched him celebrate, noting the exact lies he told and the specific promises he made to the investors, all while I was mentally cataloging the evidence I have locked away at home. I am not just a senior developer who follows orders. I am the creator of a breakthrough technology that existed long before Daniel's company even had a lease on this office. My name is Abigail Turner, and while Daniel thinks he is the one in control of this situation, he is actually just a puppet in a show that I am secretly directing from the back row. I walked out of that room with my head held high, not because I was happy, but because I knew that the truth is a heavy stone that will eventually sink his entire ship. He wants to play a game of power and ownership, but he has no idea that I have already spent 2 years mastering the rules of this specific game. The memory of my life 2 years ago is so vivid that I can almost smell the scent of stale, cold coffee and feel the hum of my overworked laptop vibrating against my fingertips. Long before I ever knew the name Daniel Reeves or stepped foot into his glass office building, I was spending every single night in my tiny, cramped apartment, building something that I truly believed in when absolutely no one else in the world even knew my name. Version 1.0 of the software was incredibly messy and full of bugs that made me want to scream, but the core logic was solid and most importantly, it actually worked exactly the way I dreamed it would. I still remember the exact timestamp on the screen when the very first successful run of the algorithm finished, glowing in the dark of my living room at 3 in the morning like a small digital miracle. I was so careful back then because I knew the value of what I was creating, so I never deleted a single draft, a single line of old code, or a single early design sketch that showed the evolution of my work. Every one of those files is still sitting on a private, encrypted hard drive that has never touched a company network, serving as a silent witness to a time when this invention belonged only to me. While Daniel is busy telling the world that this technology was born in his laboratory, my digital paper trail proves that it was actually born in a quiet apartment fueled by nothing but my own ambition and a very limited budget. He thinks he can just walk into the middle of my story and claim he wrote the beginning, but he doesn't realize that the prologue to this $15 million success story was finished long before he ever handed me a job offer. I kept every receipt, every dated cloud backup, and every original motherboard I use for testing, creating a mountain of evidence that no corporate lawyer can ever explain away. As I sit at my desk now, pretending to work on his company property, I feel a sense of absolute security knowing that my past is a locked vault that he doesn't even know exists. He is building his entire future on a lie, but I am standing on a foundation of cold, hard facts that were etched into history 2 years before I ever met him. When Daniel's company first recruited me with a flashy offer and a corner office promise, it felt like the ultimate validation of all those lonely nights I had spent doubting my own talent and vision. They didn't just hire me for nothing or out of the kindness of their hearts. They specifically sought me out because of what I could do, and the unique technical reputation I had started to build in the small circles of the engineering world. I remember sitting in Daniel's office for the first time, feeling impressed by the high-end furniture, and the way he talked about changing the world, but even then, a small voice in the back of my mind told me to be careful with my treasures. I made one critical decision during that first week of employment that would eventually become the only thing capable of saving my entire career and my $15 million invention from his greedy hands. I decided right then that I would keep all of my original files, every early version of my code, and every single experimental iteration completely separate from the company's internal servers and cloud storage. I kept those precious documents offline on my own encrypted hardware, ensuring they remained untouched by any corporate monitoring software or intellectual property sweeps that the company performed on its employees' workstations. While I was doing the work they actually paid me for during the day, I was also secretly refining my own personal project at home, making sure that the two worlds never bled into each other in a way that could cause legal confusion later. Daniel saw my talent and thought he was buying a permanent fountain of ideas that he could claim as his own, but he didn't realize that I was only giving him the water, while I kept the well itself locked behind a door he didn't even know existed. I signed his standard employment contract with a steady hand, but as I did, I knew that my most valuable assets were already safely tucked away in a place where his company property rules could never reach them. It was a simple act of digital self-defense, a way to ensure that no matter what happened at this new job, the heart of my innovation would always belong to Abigail Turner and no one else. Now, as I watch him try to steal the finished product, I am so incredibly thankful for that younger, more cautious version of myself who refused to trust a man in a $1,000 suit with her life's work. I remember sitting at my small kitchen table late at night, the only light coming from a single lamp as I carefully read through every single page of the employment contract before my first day of work. My eyes were tired and heavy, but I forced myself to focus on the dense, boring legal language until one specific clause near the middle of the document jumped out and made me pause for a long moment. The sentence was written in plain, standard font, stating that company ownership of intellectual property applies only to work specifically developed during the period of employment and created using the company's private resources or equipment. At the time, I didn't think much of it because it felt like the kind of standard, recycled language you find in every corporate agreement in the tech industry, so I just highlighted it and moved on to the next section. Now, as I stand in the hallway outside the conference room and listen to the echo of Daniel's lies, that simple sentence feels like a loaded weapon that is sitting right in the palm of my hand, ready to be fired. Daniel is so blinded by his own greed and his desire to impress the board of directors that he has completely forgotten the literal meaning of the words his own legal team wrote into my hiring papers. He is claiming that my $15 million innovation is company property, simply because I am presenting it while on his payroll, but the law and the contract are both very clear about when the clock actually starts ticking on ownership. Since the core of my technology was fully functional and documented 2 years before I ever stepped foot in this building, his claim of ownership is nothing more than a desperate fantasy built on a complete misunderstanding of his own rules. I never used a company laptop to write the primary code, and I never used a single cent of company funding to build the original prototype that proved the concept was possible. Every hour I spent on this project before my start date is a shield that he cannot pierce, and every line of my contract that he thinks protects him is actually a trap that is slowly closing around his ankles. It is almost funny how he thinks he is the master of this domain, when he hasn't even bothered to read the very document that defines our professional relationship. I feel a cold, sharp sense of relief as I realize that I am not just a victim of corporate theft. I am the owner of a legal fortress that Daniel is trying to break into with a plastic key. He is about to learn that standard language can be the most dangerous thing in the world when it is used against a thief who doesn't respect the timeline of history. A week after I officially joined the company, Daniel started dropping by my desk much more often, but he wasn't just there to check on my progress or ask about my transition into the new team. He began asking very pointed and technical questions that felt more like an interrogation than a friendly professional conversation, focusing on the deepest parts of my innovation. He didn't ask general questions about the user interface. Instead, he wanted to know exactly how I had structured the core logic and where the very first original model for the processing unit had actually come from. I remember sitting there with my heart racing, answering his questions with extreme care, and providing just enough information to satisfy his curiosity, without giving away the secret keys to the kingdom. I realized very quickly that he was trying to map out the history of the project to see if there were any gaps he could exploit, so I instinctively stopped sharing the full details of my work. Something about the way he leaned over my shoulder and the hungry look in his eyes felt completely off, like a predator trying to find a weak spot in a fence. I started giving him vague explanations about industry standard practices and iterative testing, making sure that I never mentioned the files sitting on my hard drive at home. I could tell that he was frustrated by my sudden lack of transparency, but he just smiled and patted me on the back before walking away to his private office. That was the moment I truly understood that my boss wasn't my mentor or my partner. He was a competitor who was already looking for a way to claim my brilliance as his own discovery. I went home that night and added an extra layer of encryption to my personal archives, feeling a cold shiver of realization that the battle for my $15 million idea had started much earlier than I originally thought. Daniel wanted to know the where and the how of my creation so he could rewrite the who, but he didn't realize that I was already building a wall between my job and my life's work. It was a subtle shift in our relationship, a quiet tension that filled the air every time he walked past my cubicle, but it was the warning sign I needed to stay alert. He was looking for the source of the spark, but I was the only one who knew that the fire had been burning for 2 long years before he ever arrived. The atmosphere in the office began to change almost overnight, shifting from a professional workspace into a high-stakes chessboard where Daniel was determined to be the only king. He started inserting himself into every single aspect of my project, appearing at my desk at random hours to check the flow, and offering unsolicited advice on features that I had already perfected months ago. He began rewriting my weekly status updates, subtly changing the phrasing from "Abigail developed" to "the executive team directed," making it look like he was the mastermind behind every technical breakthrough I achieved. I watched with a heavy heart as he started forwarding my detailed progress emails to the board of directors, but he would strip away my original signature and add his own commentary at the top to make it seem like he was the one overseeing the granular details. Even more frustrating was his sudden habit of sitting in on technical meetings he had never attended before, where he would lean back in his chair and nod sagely while I explained complex integration steps he barely understood. He was slowly and very quietly positioning himself at the very center of the narrative, weaving a web of lies that made it appear as though the $15 million innovation couldn't exist without his constant guidance and visionary leadership. It was a masterclass in corporate gaslighting, as he tried to make me feel like a minor assistant in my own life's work, but I kept my composure and continued to document every single interaction. I noticed how he would speak over me when I tried to explain the original logic of the power cells, redirecting the conversation back to his own vague ideas about market scalability and brand identity. He was trying to erase my presence from the project one email and one meeting at a time, hoping that by the time we reached the final launch, the board would only remember his face and his voice. I realized that this was no longer just a job or a career path. It was a battle for the very soul of my creation, and Daniel was playing a very dirty game. Despite the growing knot of anxiety in my stomach, I refused to let him see me sweat, continuing to perform my duties with a robotic precision while I waited for the perfect moment to reveal the truth. He thought he was successfully stealing the spotlight, but he didn't realize that I was the one holding the flashlight, and I knew exactly when to turn it off. The exact moment it finally clicked for me was on a Tuesday afternoon when I happened to walk past the glass-walled executive boardroom and saw my own complex architectural framework projected onto the massive screen. I hadn't been invited to the meeting, and my name was nowhere on the introductory slide. But as I stood frozen in the hallway, I could hear Daniel's voice through the heavy door, reciting my technical notes word for word as if he had spent a lifetime studying them. He wasn't just giving a general summary. He was explaining the deep-level logic gates and the proprietary synchronization methods that I had personally invented in my apartment 2 years ago. That was the sickening second when I truly knew that this was never about professional collaboration or team growth. It was about careful, cold-blooded preparation for a total corporate takeover of my identity. Daniel wasn't trying to help me refine the project for the company's benefit. He was systematically absorbing my knowledge, so he could eventually discard me like an empty shell once the $15 million deal was finalized. I watched through the glass as the investors leaned in, hanging on his every word, while he gestured at my diagrams with a confident, practiced ease that made my blood turn to ice. He was building a narrative where he was the sole architect of this breakthrough, and by excluding me from the room, he was ensuring that no one would ever think to ask who actually wrote the original code. I realized that every friendly question he had asked me over the past few months was just a way for him to rehearse his performance before the big show. He didn't just want the money. He wanted the reputation of being a genius, and he was willing to erase 2 years of my life's work to get it. As I walked back to my desk, my heart was pounding with a mixture of intense fury and a strange, sharp sense of clarity. The mask was officially off, and although Daniel didn't know that I had seen him, the power dynamic had shifted in my mind forever. I wasn't just a senior developer anymore. I was a witness to a crime, and I knew that if I didn't act with extreme precision, I would lose everything I had worked for. He thought he was preparing for a massive payday, but he was actually just preparing the evidence I would eventually use to bring his entire career crashing down around him. That night, I went home and immediately opened my external hard drive, the small blue light flickering in my dark living room like a silent ally in the coming war. I spent hours scrolling through organized folders, precise dates, and multiple versions of my work, feeling a surge of relief as I saw the undeniable proof of my own history laid out in digital ink. I spent the next few hours creating even more duplicates, uploading encrypted cloud backups to private servers, and tucking physical archives away in a fireproof safe. If something went wrong in that glass office, I wasn't going to be caught unprepared or empty-handed while Daniel tried to rewrite the past with his expensive lawyers. Every single timestamp on these files is a physical barrier that Daniel can't cross, and every early sketch is a witness to the truth of who actually built this $15 million dream. I felt a cold, steady sense of power as I watched the progress bars finish their uploads, knowing that my evidence was now scattered across the internet where no one could ever delete it. Daniel thinks he can control the narrative because he controls my current paycheck, but he has no idea that I have already built a fortress of facts that he can't even see. I am not just a developer anymore. I am a curator of my own legacy, and I am making sure that every single receipt is accounted for before the final confrontation. The more I looked at my original code from 2 years ago, the more I realized how much of my own soul I had poured into this project before the company even existed. This backup isn't just about data. It's about making sure that the truth stays alive even if Daniel tries to kill it with his corporate lies and his fake smiles. I closed my laptop with a quiet click, finally feeling a sense of peace that I hadn't felt since the meeting began. The next morning, I walked into the office wearing my most professional, neutral expression, acting as if the betrayal from the day before had never even happened. I made sure to be exceptionally helpful during the morning stand-up meeting, offering clear data points and cooperating with every one of Daniel's increasingly bold requests with a quiet, obedient nod. If he wanted to claim total ownership of my life's work, I was going to let him take it completely and publicly so that there would be no doubt later about exactly what he was trying to steal. I watched him strut around the department like a peacock, stopping at the desks of other developers to explain the logic of my system, as if he had been the one to mentor me through every single hurdle. I didn't correct him when he mispronounced the name of the primary algorithm, and I didn't flinch when he told a junior engineer that the project was his own personal brainchild from 5 years ago. I realized that for my trap to work perfectly, I needed Daniel to feel absolutely invincible and totally secure in his lie so that he would eventually put everything in writing. I spent my afternoon refining the presentation slides for the next big investor meeting, intentionally leaving plenty of space for him to add his name as the lead inventor and primary architect. Every time he corrected my work or added a company watermark to my original diagrams, I simply smiled and thanked him for his valuable input, playing the part of the grateful employee to absolute perfection. He was so blinded by his own ego that he couldn't see the cold, calculating fire in my eyes, and he truly believed that I was just another worker bee who was happy to stay in his shadow. I made sure to BCC my personal email on every single document he modified, creating a digital trail of him actively claiming my pre-existing work as company resources. By the time the clock struck 5, Daniel was convinced that he had successfully conquered both the technology and the person who created it, never realizing that I was the one who had actually opened the gate for him. I left the office with a polite wave, knowing that every help I provided today was just another piece of evidence that would eventually prove his intent to defraud me. He thinks he is taking everything from me, but he is actually just walking deeper into a legal maze where I am the only one who holds the map to the exit. The project began to scale at an incredibly fast pace, moving from a small internal prototype to a massive corporate initiative that attracted more attention from every corner of the high-end office building. We started having much bigger meetings with external partners, and the executive visibility for the innovation reached a point where even the global CEO was sending congratulatory emails to our department. Daniel leaned into this newfound fame even harder than before, physically positioning himself at the front of every room and starting to use the phrase "my project" in almost every single sentence he spoke to the press and the investors. Each time he took credit for a technical breakthrough that I had actually coded in my pajamas 2 years ago, I simply forced a pleasant smile and continued to act like his most supportive and loyal subordinate. Behind the scenes, I was working harder than ever, but I wasn't just building the software. I was meticulously documenting every single instance where Daniel publicly claimed the technology as a recent company-funded invention. I saved every recorded Zoom call, every printed transcript of his speeches, and every internal memo where he explicitly stated that the development started under his direct supervision last year. It was almost like watching a man build a very tall tower on a foundation of wet sand, and I was the only person in the world who knew exactly when the tide was going to come in and wash it all away. Daniel became so comfortable with his lie that he stopped being cautious, often bragging about the months of brainstorming he did to come up with the core algorithm that I had actually perfected long before I ever met him. I kept my personal logs updated with extreme precision, noting the dates, times, and witnesses for every false claim he made in front of the board of directors. The expansion of the project meant that the stakes were getting higher, but it also meant that Daniel's eventually fall would be much more public and much more devastating for his professional reputation. I felt a cold, steady sense of purpose as I watched him soak up the unearned praise, knowing that I was effectively giving him enough rope to hang his entire career. He thought the growing momentum of the project was a sign of his absolute victory, but in reality, it was just making the eventual explosion of the truth that much larger. As the valuation of the technology climbed toward that $15 million mark, I stayed quiet and kept my eyes on the calendar, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal my hidden hand. One night, while the office was empty and the only sound was the distant hum of the cleaning crew's vacuum, I found the absolute smoking gun I had been looking for deep within a nested internal email chain. I was searching for a technical specification document when I stumbled upon a thread between Daniel and the primary investors where he explicitly and boldly claimed that he was the one who had initiated the core concept of the technology during a private brainstorming session years ago. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared at the glowing blue light of the computer screen for a very long time, reading his calculated lies over and over until the words blurred into a haze of digital betrayal. He wasn't just claiming the work I did last month. He was actively fabricating a historical timeline that placed him at the center of the invention's birth, long before he had ever even seen my resume. It was a chilling level of dishonesty that showed me exactly how far he was willing to go to secure that $15 million payday, and the prestige that came with it. I didn't panic or lash out. Instead, I took a slow, deep breath and immediately forwarded the entire unedited chain to my private, encrypted personal archive, ensuring that I had a permanent copy with all the original header data intact. This was another crucial piece of the puzzle, a digital confession that proved Daniel was not just mistaken about the ownership, but was actively and intentionally committing fraud against both me and the company's shareholders. Every word he typed in that email was a nail in the coffin of his own career, and I felt a cold, sharp sense of satisfaction knowing that he had provided the evidence against himself in his own handwriting. He thought these private conversations with the board were safe from the eyes of a simple developer like me, but he forgot that I am the one who built the very systems he uses to communicate his lies. I sat there in the dark office for a few more minutes, realizing that Daniel's arrogance had made him incredibly sloppy and overconfident in his ability to manipulate the truth. This email chain was the bridge between his public theft and his private intent, and having it in my possession felt like holding a winning lottery ticket that he didn't even know was missing from his pocket. I logged out of the system with a steady hand, feeling more prepared than ever for the final confrontation that was rapidly approaching as the project neared its official launch date. He thinks he is the master of the narrative, but he is actually just the lead character in a tragedy that I have already finished writing, and the ending is going to be much different than he expects. The atmosphere in the office turned electric as the board of directors officially scheduled the final, high-stakes presentation that would decide the fate of the entire project. This was the big one. The meeting that would finally secure the full $15 million in funding and launch the technology into the global market. Daniel was absolutely ecstatic, pacing around his office and constantly checking his reflection in the glass, already acting like he was a billionaire who had just conquered the world. He spent every hour barking orders at the junior staff and obsessively polishing the marketing slides that featured his name in the largest possible font. I, on the other hand, remained unervingly calm, moving through the office with a steady, quiet energy that Daniel completely mistook for submission or intimidation. I helped him prepare the technical demonstrations and even double-checked the power requirements for the prototype, acting as the perfect, supportive assistant while the clock ticked down toward his supposed moment of glory. Because I knew something very important that he didn't, a small technical detail that I had purposely kept to myself during our many brainstorming sessions over the past few months. I knew that the core algorithm had a very specific built-in security handshake that required an original, encrypted digital key to run for more than 24 hours without a total system reset. This key wasn't something created on a company computer. It was embedded in the very first version of the software I wrote in my apartment 2 years before I ever met him. Without that original key, which existed only on my private offline hard drive, the entire $15 million innovation was essentially a very expensive paperweight waiting to shut down. Daniel was so busy claiming he initiated the core concept that he never actually bothered to learn how the deep-level security protocols functioned. He was walking into the most important meeting of his life with a stolen engine that he didn't know how to start or maintain. As the deadline approached and the tension in the building reached a breaking point, I sat at my desk and quietly sipped my lukewarm coffee, watching the sunset through the window. I felt a strange sense of clarity, knowing that the trap I had set wasn't built out of anger, but out of the simple cold facts of my own history. Daniel thought he was at the finish line, but he was actually just standing at the edge of a very steep cliff that he had spent months building for himself. I checked my personal archive one last time, ensuring every timestamp was in place, and then I packed my bag and walked out of the building, ready for the storm that would break the next morning. I didn't take my grievances to the HR department because I knew that their primary job is to protect the company and its high-level executives like Daniel Reeves, rather than seeking justice for a single developer. Instead, I spent my Saturday morning in a quiet, sun-drenched office on the other side of town, sitting across from a sharp-eyed lawyer who specialized in intellectual property and high-stakes corporate litigation. I moved quietly and kept our meeting strictly professional, laying out my original documents, the encrypted hard drives, and the mountain of evidence I had been gathering since that first day Daniel tried to steal my credit. When I finally showed him the undeniable ironclad timestamps on the core algorithm, dates that clearly showed the project was fully functional 2 years before I ever signed my employment contract, he stopped scrolling and leaned back in his leather chair with a slow, calculating whistle. He looked at the screen and then back at me, a small and knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he tapped his pen against the mahogany desk. Abigail, I have seen a lot of corporate theft in my career, but this is a very special case because of how meticulously you have preserved the history of your creation, he said, his voice calm but filled with a growing sense of legal excitement. He explained that based on the specific language of my contract and the physical proof of my prior work, this innovation was absolutely not their property and never had been, regardless of what Daniel told the board. He told me that by claiming my personal history as company resources, Daniel was actually committing a massive act of fraud that could potentially void the entire $15 million deal and leave the company vulnerable to a devastating lawsuit. I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders as a professional confirmed what I had known all along, giving me the legal green light to proceed with my plan for the final presentation. We spent the next 3 hours drafting a formal notice of ownership and preparing the specific evidence that we would drop like a bombshell when the timing was exactly right. My lawyer told me to keep acting normal and to let Daniel continue his public performance for just a little bit longer so that his false claims would be officially recorded in the meeting minutes. I walked out of that office feeling like I was finally armed with the shield that no amount of corporate bullying could ever break. Daniel thinks he is about to sign the biggest deal of his life, but he doesn't realize that I now have a legal expert standing right behind me in the shadows, waiting for the signal to move. The fire in my chest was replaced by a cold, calculating determination as I realized that the law was firmly on my side, and the truth was about to become Daniel's worst nightmare. We didn't file a single legal document or send a single warning letter to the company's headquarters that afternoon, because my lawyer and I both understood that the success of our counterattack depended entirely on the precision of our timing. We decided to wait in the shadows for a little while longer, staying completely silent and letting the pressure build, because we needed Daniel to walk so far out onto his own lie that there would be no possible way for him to climb back to safety. For our plan to work with maximum impact, Daniel needed to fully and explicitly claim the technology as his own creation in a setting that was public, recorded, and completely irreversible in the eyes of the law. If we struck too early, he could simply claim he made a mistake or that there was a misunderstanding about the development timeline, allowing him to keep his job and potentially bury my evidence with corporate influence. But if we waited until he stood in front of the board of directors and the primary investors to sign his name to a formal ownership declaration, his theft would transition from a simple office lie into a massive, undeniable act of securities fraud. My lawyer explained that we were essentially letting Daniel build his own prison cell, by giving him the freedom to boast about his innovative genius to anyone who would listen. Every interview he gave to the local business journals and every internal memo he signed where he used the words "my intellectual property" was just another layer of concrete being added to the case we were building against him. It was incredibly difficult to sit at my desk and listen to him brag about the $15 million valuation, while knowing that I had the power to end his career with a single phone call, but I forced myself to remain patient and focused on the bigger picture. I spent my evenings reviewing the final presentation materials, making sure that everything was perfectly aligned so that when Daniel finally took his victory lap, he would be doing it on a track that led directly to a legal dead end. I felt a cold, sharp sense of discipline as I watched him prepare for the big funding meeting, knowing that his greatest moment of triumph was actually going to be the exact moment of his professional destruction. He thought my silence was a sign that I had accepted my role as a background character in his success story, but he had no idea that I was actually the one holding the stopwatch for his downfall. The strategy was simple. Let the thief get comfortable with the stolen goods until he tries to sell them to the world, and then reveal that the owner never actually let go of the keys. The conference room felt colder than usual, a vast expanse of polished mahogany and floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over a city skyline currently bathed in the golden, deceptive glow of a setting sun. I took my seat at the far end of the table, blending into the background as the heavy hitters arrived, men and women in charcoal suits whose signatures carried the weight of millions. Daniel stood at the head of the room, his posture radiating a predatory kind of confidence that he had spent weeks perfecting in front of his office mirror. He began the presentation with a flourish, his voice steady and charismatic as he toggled through slides that I had meticulously formatted, though my name was conspicuously absent from every single one of them. He spoke about our journey and his vision, weaving a narrative of innovation that sounded like a heroic epic, conveniently omitting the 2 years I spent in my pajamas coding the backbone of this system before I even knew his name. When he reached the climax of his pitch, he leaned forward, his palms flat on the table, and looked the lead investor directly in the eye. This innovation, he declared with a finality that made my blood run cold, was developed entirely within our organization, utilizing our proprietary resources and under my direct, hands-on supervision from day one. There it was, the definitive, irreversible lie recorded in the digital minutes of the meeting. The room was silent for a heartbeat, the air thick with the smell of expensive coffee, and the palpable excitement of a $15 million deal nearing its completion. I didn't flinch, didn't cough, and didn't offer a single correction to his blatant fabrication. I simply sat there, a ghost in the machine, watching as the investors nodded in approval, completely enchanted by the performance of a man who couldn't explain the logic of a single subroutine without a script. Daniel glanced at me for a split second, a flicker of triumph in his eyes that suggested he thought he had finally broken my spirit and secured my silence. He didn't realize that by speaking those words into a room full of witnesses, he had just stepped into the center of a legal snare that I had been laying for months. I felt a strange, detached sense of clarity, realizing that the man I once looked up to was nothing more than a high-stakes shoplifter in a tailored suit. As the board members began to murmur their praises and reach for their pens, I maintained my mask of quiet cooperation, knowing that the trap was now fully primed. The presentation wasn't just a sales pitch. It was the primary evidence for the fraud case that was already waiting in my lawyer's briefcase. I remained perfectly still, a silent witness to my own erasure, because I knew that the louder he claimed ownership now, the harder the truth would hit him when the sun rose tomorrow. The atmosphere in the room shifted from anticipation to a solemn, business-like efficiency as the final stack of contracts was brought in by a silent assistant. These weren't just papers, they were the physical manifestation of a $15 million lie, bound in leather and printed on heavy cream-colored stock that felt far too elegant for the deception it contained. One by one, the clauses were summarized, emphasizing the company's total and exclusive ownership of all intellectual property related to the project, a point that Daniel reinforced with a series of enthusiastic, supportive nods. I watched the gold nib of the lead investor's pen hover over the signature line, a tiny point of light that represented the finality of the transaction. Daniel didn't hesitate when the folder was slid toward him. He signed his name with a grand sweeping flourish, the ink glistening wetly on the page like a fresh wound. In that moment, the ownership was finalized, the funding was officially approved, and the narrative of his inventive genius was codified into the corporate record. It was permanent and official, a legal reality that linked his identity to my work in a way that he believed was unbreakable and absolute. This was exactly what my lawyer and I had waited for, the moment where his intent to defraud became a documented, signed, and witnessed action. He wasn't just taking credit in a hallway conversation anymore. He was claiming a $15 million asset under false pretenses, a move that transitioned his behavior from office politics into the realm of serious white-collar crime. As the last signatures were collected and the room erupted into a round of polite, self-congratulatory applause, Daniel looked around the table with the expression of a king who had just conquered a new continent. He offered me a brief, dismissive nod of acknowledgement, the kind of gesture a master gives to a loyal servant who helped carry the luggage. I felt a surge of cold, calculating adrenaline, but I kept my hands steady as I packed my tablet into my bag, my silence acting as the perfect camouflage for the counterattack that was already in motion. The board members began to stand, shaking hands and discussing celebration dinners, oblivious to the fact that the documents they were so carefully filing away were actually the blueprints for their own impending crisis. Daniel was riding a wave of unearned glory, convinced that he had successfully maneuvered me into a corner where I could never fight back without losing my career. He didn't understand that by signing those papers, he had handed me the very weapon I needed to destroy his reputation and reclaim my legacy. I walked out of the room quietly, the weight of the secret I carried feeling less like a burden and more like a shield, ready for the dawn of a very different kind of day. The next morning, the office was quiet, the usual hum of productivity replaced by a lingering hungover sense of triumph from the previous day's success. I sat at my desk and watched the clock, my eyes tracking the second hand as it ticked toward the exact moment my lawyer would be entering the courthouse on the other side of the city. While Daniel was likely still basked in the glow of his supposed victory, the official intellectual property claim was being filed, accompanied by a mountain of evidence that made his claims look like a child's fairy tale. The filing included every timestamp version of my code from 2 years prior, the original design schematics saved on my personal servers, and the encrypted logs of every development milestone I had reached long before I ever applied for this job. We didn't just submit a complaint. We submitted a chronological history of a creation that Daniel couldn't possibly have initiated or supervised. I didn't feel the slightest bit of nerves as I pulled up my email and saw the confirmation that the board of directors had just been served with the notice of ownership. Instead, I felt a deep, grounded sense of steadiness, the kind of calm that only comes when you know the truth is an immovable object and the lie is a crumbling wall. I watched from my cubicle as the first ripples of the storm began to hit the executive floor. A hurried conversation between secretaries, a sudden frantic phone call from the legal department, and the sight of the CEO walking toward the boardroom with a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. I didn't need to shout or make a scene. The paperwork was doing all the talking for me, speaking in a language of dates and digital signatures that no amount of corporate charm could refute. Daniel emerged from his office a few minutes later, looking confused and slightly annoyed by the sudden shift in the building's energy, still unaware that his entire world was about to be turned inside out. I looked back at my screen, focusing on a minor task, playing the part of the unassuming developer until the very moment the door to the executive suite slammed shut. The steady rhythm of my breathing matched the quiet confidence of the evidence we had presented, a silent assurance that my 2 years of solitary labor were finally going to be recognized for what they were. Daniel had spent months trying to build a cage for me out of my own work, but he had forgotten that I was the one who designed the lock and held the only set of keys. As the first emergency meeting was called and the lawyers began to swarm the building, I realized that the fight was already over before it. The collapse didn't happen with a roar. It happened with the clinical, terrifying speed of a high-speed computer crash that erases everything in its path. Within hours of the filing, the $15 million funding that Daniel had been so proud of was frozen solid, as the investors realized they had potentially purchased a legal nightmare instead of a technological breakthrough. Legal notices and cease and desist orders began to fly through the office like shrapnel, hitting the desks of everyone who had signed off on the deal without checking the facts. The board of directors, once Daniel's greatest allies, turned on him with a ferocity that was breathtaking to witness, their primary concern shifting instantly from profit to self-preservation. Ownership is the only thing that matters in this industry, and the moment that ownership became a jagged public question mark, the entire deal was effectively dead on arrival. I watched through the glass walls as the emergency meetings grew more heated, the once cordial executives now shouting over one another as they tried to figure out how they had been so thoroughly deceived. Daniel was summoned into the room not as a leader, but as a defendant, and for the first time, his charismatic smile was nowhere to be found, replaced by a mask of pale, sweating desperation. His project, the one he had claimed was his personal brainchild, began to unravel in real time as the lawyers cross-referenced his claims against the undeniable timestamps of my original work. The investors pulled back immediately, their scouts and analysts already looking for the exit, because they knew that without clear title to the intellectual property, there was absolutely no product to sell. I sat at my desk in the middle of the chaos, a calm island in a sea of corporate panic, watching as the empire Daniel had built out of stolen bricks came tumbling down around his ears. It was a total and absolute failure of leadership, a collapse triggered by the very greed and arrogance that had driven him to steal my credit in the first place. By mid-afternoon, the celebratory banners that had been ordered for the launch were being quietly taken down, and the office felt more like a crime scene than a center of innovation. Daniel's reputation, which he had spent a decade building on the backs of others, was evaporating in the heat of the legal fire I had set, leaving him with nothing but a signed confession of his own fraud. The $15 million was gone, the investors were gone, and the man who thought he was a king was left standing in the ruins of a fantasy, he never actually owned. I wasn't physically in the room when the final confrontation took place, but the silence that followed the shouting was loud enough to tell me everything I needed to know about the outcome. From my desk, I could hear the muffled, sharp tones of the board members as they laid out the evidence we had provided, presenting Daniel with a reality that he could no longer manipulate or explain away. They hit him with questions about the deep-level logic that he had claimed to invent, and I could almost hear his stammering, vague responses as he realized he didn't even understand the basic principles of the technology he tried to steal. The proof was undeniable. The emails where he claimed he initiated the concept, the dates that predated his employment, and the raw code that matched my personal archives byte for byte. It all pointed to a single devastating truth that no amount of corporate gaslighting could obscure. He didn't build a single line of this innovation, and more importantly, he knew it every step of the way. He had intentionally and maliciously attempted to erase my contributions to secure a payday and a title he didn't earn, and now he was being forced to look at the cold, hard receipts of his own dishonesty. I watched through the glass as the lead investor stood up and walked out, his face a mask of disgust, leaving Daniel alone at the table with a pile of documents that proved he was a fraud. The visionary had been unmasked as a common thief, and the company was now scrambling to figure out how to handle the massive liability he had created for them. All the technical details he had grilled me about over the past few months were now being used as weapons against him, showing that his only contribution was a series of interrogation sessions designed to help him faking his way through a presentation. The truth was finally out in the open, stripped of the marketing fluff and the executive ego, revealing that I was the sole architect of the system and he was just a man who tried to put his name on the blueprint. I felt a profound sense of relief, not because of the revenge, but because the 2 years of my life I had poured into this project were finally being recognized as mine. Daniel's face, which I could see clearly through the boardroom window, was the color of ash as he realized that the standard language of the contract he had ignored was now the very thing that was going to end his career. He had spent his life thinking he was the smartest person in the room, but he had finally met a truth that was smarter, faster, and more prepared than he would ever be. I didn't stay in that office long enough to see Daniel escorted out, and I didn't wait for a hollow apology from a board that only valued me once they realized they couldn't steal from me. I resigned that same afternoon, my head held high and my legal victory secured, the rights to my technology reverting back to me in a settlement that was as clean and undeniable as the code itself. The legal battle had been short but decisive, leaving me as the sole owner of the intellectual property, while the company was left to deal with the fallout of Daniel's disgraced legacy. 6 months later, I launched the project independently from a small focused office that I built with my own hands and my own rules. It was the same technology, the same vision for a more efficient future, but it had a new name, one that represented the honesty and the sweat I had poured into it over the years. The market responded with an enthusiasm that Daniel had only dreamed of, not because of a charismatic pitch, but because the innovation actually worked exactly the way I said it would. This time there were no glass walls to hide behind and no corporate gatekeepers to claim my brilliance as their own discovery. I had learned a lesson in that high-stakes conference room that no engineering degree or business seminar could ever provide. I learned that silence isn't a sign of weakness or a lack of ambition. Sometimes silence is the ultimate strategy, a way to let the noise of a lie become so loud that it eventually deafens the person telling it. I stood on the stage of my own launch event, looking out at a crowd of peers and investors who were there to see the real work of the real creator. No one could take it from me this time because I had built a fortress of facts and a history of documentation that made my ownership as solid as the logic in my algorithms. Daniel was a memory, a cautionary tale of what happens when ego outpaces ethics, while I was finally the master of my own domain. The rise wasn't about the $15 million valuation, though that came soon enough. It was about the freedom to look in the mirror and know that everything I had achieved was earned, documented, and entirely mine. I realized that by staying quiet and playing the long game, I hadn't just saved my project, I had saved my career and my integrity. The silence had been my greatest weapon, and now it was finally time for the work to speak for itself.